especially when you have a new study, preparing for screening a patient, if it's a new study, you need to have like a mock screening visit with your colleague. Like you find another coordinator, or hopefully you have a backup coordinator that you guys can do a mock screening visit with. Trust me, it's going to make your life a lot easier the next day that you're actually doing the screening, because there are so many portals involved, and when you're doing something that's brand new, you want to at least have a dress rehearsal. Once you start doing a few screenings, you won't need to do mock screenings anymore. But at least prior to the first visit, you want to have some practice. And you may not be able to do everything the real way. Like you might go to the IRT system, but not actually be able to register anyone, because you obviously can't, because it's a mock visit. But you want to at least make sure that you have your logins and that you are able to log in and actually try to log in. You'll be surprised how many times you go to the IRT when a real patient's there, and somehow you don't have access, and then the patient's sitting there staring at you and probably getting frustrated because they want to get out of there too. I've had this personally happen to me way too many times here in Yuma Clinical Trials on new studies. So now we make it a requirement that you do a mock visit before your screening and your randomization. So you also want to have all your documents ready. You don't want to be looking for your informed consent form the day the patient's there. Like you want to have it ready. Make sure all the pages are there if you're using paper consent. Make sure it's the most recently approved version of the informed consent. And to do this, you need to go to your IRB portal, and you need to make sure you have the most recently approved informed consent form available. So make sure you are using the most recently IRB approved informed consent form. Again, you don't want to be double checking this when the patient's there. You want to have it all beforehand. Same if you're using electronic consent. They don't automatically populate. Not always, at least. We use Creo, and there is a way Creo can automatically update it, but someone still has to upload the most approved version in order for that to do it. So even if you're using streamlining tools, don't assume that it's the correct one. And it's a pretty major deviation if you're not using the most recently approved informed consent form when you are screening a patient. And again, like that bullet point says here, if you need a Spanish version consent or another language other than English, make sure you have it there. Like a lot of these things seem simple, but when I've seen it too many times where staff doesn't have things ready to go. Same thing with lab kits. Make sure you have a screening lab kit available, and make sure it's not an expired lab kit. And then make sure that the patient actually shows up. So remind them the day before the visit. And I love Creo, because Creo, and not only do they sponsor my videos, but we use Creo at my site. You can program it to automatically remind patients about their visits, and you can even put notes there for the patients like, hey, make sure you come in fasting. Although be careful with that part for a screening visit, because you technically cannot ask a patient to come in fasting before they sign a consent form. I've heard from IRB ethicists and things like that, that's some gray area. So what I do when I schedule the screening visit, I tell them exactly verbatim, we're not allowed to ask you to come in fasting, but if you do come in fasting, you don't need to come in again for a blood draw if you decide to be screened. And they almost always come in fasting at that point. So just make sure that you are aware of what you're not allowed to do and what you are allowed to do. And then make sure that you have all the support staff ready. Make sure they all know. Like if you know your patient's coming in at 8, make sure that you have a phlebotomist ready to draw blood at 8:30, because typically a consent process takes about 30 minutes, maybe longer. But make sure a phlebotomist is there, make sure your PI is aware, make sure the sub-investigator is aware, and make sure the patient also the morning of, so if you reminded them the day before, make sure you follow up with them the morning of about them coming in or not, because the last thing you want happening is all these people, all these support staff to be ready, willing, and able to come in, and then the patient decides not to show up. And now all those people kind of wasting time. So make sure you know beforehand, the morning of, hey, are you still planning to come in? Just confirming you're on the schedule. Oftentimes the patient will confirm and then you know they're coming, but sometimes they'll say, oh, you know what? I feel under the weather today. Can we reschedule? So then you could tell your other staff, hey, they're actually not coming. At our site, we do a lot of psychiatric trials right now, and it's very common to have a no-show for a screening visit. I mean, almost 50% of the time now, which is pretty high. So just make sure that you have all these things in order and ready to go so that if the patient does come in for the screening visit, that it's smooth and that it's as quick as it can be, so that the patient doesn't sit there wasting time while you guys are trying to figure out who has access to what portal and where the lab kits are and all that kind of stuff. It looks very unprofessional if you're not prepared. So that's what I have to say about this particular visit. Of course, make sure you have your source documents ready and make sure you know what you're going to be doing. I mean, it might sound funny to have to remind people, but you should know what you're doing for the visit when the patient comes in. So usually this means having source documentation ready, the source templates ready. Again, we use Creo, but in the case of Creo, make sure your source documents are complete and that they are compliant with the most recently approved version of the protocol. And then the more visits you do as screening a patient for a study, the better you'll get at it, and it'll soon become second nature. But the very first time you're doing a new screening visit for a new study, it's going to be quite challenging, even if you are experienced and know what you're doing, because it's a new study. So that's what I have to say about this slide. If there's any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next slide.